Welcome to ECANA Learning Lab. This presentation is brought to you in part by AZI.
So today's learning objectives will be identifying what clinical trials are, explaining the clinical trial cycle, recognizing common clinical trial myths and misconceptions, describing barriers that exist to participating in clinical trials, and determining personal, communal, and societal benefits of clinical trial participation. The outline for today will be going over clinical trial basics, getting through the roots of medical distrust, and moving forward in the benefits of clinical trial participation. So before we even get into the content, I would really like to know, have you, our participants, ever heard of a clinical trial? We have a poll that should have just popped up for you. Please take a moment to fill out the poll. I think it gives about a minute for everybody to answer. That's really great so far. It looks like most people have heard of a clinical trial at the very least.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. That's really good. Very happy to see it. I wanted to ask this question in particular because as I was doing research and I was just asking people around me, I found that a lot of people hadn't really heard of one before, or at least they didn't have a full understanding of what one was and the process of it. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your answers. Tiffany, I'll let you take over for this section.
Sure. Thank you so much. Most of you are familiar with the clinical trial. Some of you have never heard of the clinical trial or aren't familiar, and some of you aren't sure, which is, I'm glad that you were able to share that experience because some people aren't sure if they heard about it. Like maybe they offered me a clinical trial, but I wasn't really sure. And that can be a part of just understanding the communication as well with your healthcare provider. So clinical trials are research studies that test one or more medical, surgical, or behavioral interventions in people, and they are also known as interventional studies. What is a clinical trial and what are the aims of what clinical research does? So the aims of clinical research are testing ways to diagnose a disease early, sometimes before there are even any symptoms. And as we know with endometrial cancer, there are symptoms, but there are no screening. So that's part of what we need to be doing in terms of having outreach and education and programs just like this as well. Finding approaches to prevent a health problem, including in people who are healthy, but at increased risk of developing a disease. And something else that I also tell people when I talk about clinical research is when we say healthy people, if you're in cancer, we're not going to give chemotherapy to someone who does not have cancer. But you can be a healthy cancer patient, right? So that's also something that's a misconception in terms of who are eligible to participate in clinical trials. One of the aims is also to improve quality of life for people living with a life-threatening disease or a chronic health problem. Again, most of them we think about cancer, we think about diabetes, those chronic conditions, and there are also behavioral studies, right? There are also like dementia, Alzheimer's, diseases such as that as well. And studying the role of caregivers and support groups. As I mentioned before, I was a caregiver, and there aren't many support systems out there for caregivers or even the opportunity to understand more about clinical research and what your loved one may be going through during their treatment. How does someone get involved in a clinical trial? Researchers look for people who fit a certain description, and that's called eligibility or inclusion and exclusion criteria. So just because you have cancer doesn't mean you're automatically eligible for a study because they look at other factors as well. These criteria give details on who can and cannot join a study, which can include people of a certain age or sex, people who do or do not have a certain illness, disease, or health condition, people with or without a certain health history, such as prior treatments, people who are exposed to or are in contact with someone that affects their health. And so following this criteria helps participants to stay safe and ensures that the correct data is being recorded to answer the research questions. And that is the number one goal that we want in clinical trials, is to keep our patients safe.
Now we're going to look at the clinical trial cycle. First, from the perspective of the research, and then from the perspective of the patient. So in each of the phases, you're going to be testing a slightly larger group. In phase one, we start with a relatively small group between 20 to 80 people, and this is the people being tested for the first time. Now, I do want to pause to note that before it even reaches this state, or this stage, I guess I should say, it has gone through testing with animals. Animal testing is required before anything comes to testing with humans. And that is just so researchers can gain a better understanding of the safety around a drug before they bring it to the human population. So just wanted to get that out of the way before we get into the rest of the phases. So again, we start with a group of between 20 to 80 people, and the purpose is to study the drug or treatment to learn, again, about its safety and any side effects that may be present that weren't identified before. As we move into phase 2, we move into a group of between 100 to 300 people to continue determining effectiveness and to further study the safety of the drug or treatment. By phase 3, we reach relatively larger groups of people. So this is when we get into the thousands from the hundreds. We continue to confirm the effectiveness, monitor side effects, which usually you'll be able to get a lot more data at this point out of people and potential side effects. Obviously, different drugs and treatments, people respond to them differently. So this is a really important stage. Not that all of the stages are important, but I would say this is a very, very crucial stage. And there are even some studies that do not make it to this phase just because of either the results or the overall effectiveness. It's not really meeting the standard of care that's available, things of that nature. So again, I just say phase 3. I think is when people get a bit more serious about looking towards specific drugs for potential future treatment. And then by phase 4, the drug's been approved by the FDA. It's made available to the public, and researchers continue then to track from there the safety in the general population, seeking even more information about the potential treatment benefits or its optimal use. And then from the patient perspective, usually it starts with diagnosis. A patient is diagnosed with an illness or disease. And usually a patient is made aware of a clinical trial in one of 3 ways. There are other ways, but I think these are the 3 most common ways that people are made aware. Through their medical team, through advocate assistance, and by that I mean usually there is a patient advocate either at the hospital or through an advocacy organization such as ECANA that works with the patient directly to get them, make them aware of specific studies that are available for them. Because as Tiffany mentioned, just because you have cancer doesn't mean you're eligible for every study out there. Obviously, you'd want to get down to your specific cancer type. And then there are just other factors that go into what people are looking for, what questions they're looking to answer in their research. And then sometimes people find these studies through personal discovery. A way that I know advocates that I personally know have made themselves aware is through clinicaltrials.gov. I will say it is a beast of a website. It can be very much a hassle to navigate for people. So if anyone does want to go looking, I just want to give that caution and that warning. But again, it can be done. People have done it. And then we move into treatment. When a patient does meet study criteria and they make the personal decision to be involved in a clinical trial, they're able to be involved. Usually more in-depth screening takes place after initial screening, and then they are assigned to a treatment group after. Usually people are randomly assigned, depending on how the study is set up, which basically means that the researcher nor the patient can choose which group they're going to be a part of. But it's important to know whatever group that you're going to be a part of, it's not that one group is going to receive a placebo or not receive any treatment at all. You're always going to receive treatment should you need it in these situations. And involvement looks different depending on the trial, but informed consent must be maintained. Now, I really want to stress what informed consent is because it's not just agreeing to the trial, but it's an ongoing conversation and understanding between the patient and the researcher, ensuring that the patient is fully aware of the experiment and the risk and benefits. As well as alternative treatments that are available to them, and also that they can choose to stop participating in the research trial at any time. And symptoms and side effects are closely monitored as they're going through treatment. Participation will only be allowed so long as the research team knows that it is safe for the patient to continue to be involved in the study. And then phase 4, monitoring. Following the conclusion of the trial, the patient will continue to be monitored for recurrence and receive any additional support that they might need for any side effects from the treatment or just anything that comes with um, them being involved in the trial. So I want to take a pause here and just ask the audience, and please reflect your answers in the chat. What are some concerns you've had or heard about clinical trial or research participation. Maybe you haven't considered it for yourself, but maybe you've heard somebody else talking about it before and maybe they've given their opinion. What are some concerns that you've heard around research participation or clinical trial participation?
Brittany, while we're getting that, Deb actually asked a very great question. She said, what percentage of participants drop out of the trial normally? And can a trial be stopped if there are not enough remaining participants? Very good question, Deb. What are your thoughts, Brittany?
I think this would vary depending on the trial.
Hmm.
I don't know if I can give an exact average, especially just considering the vast different amounts of
Hmm.
trials that there are. It can vary really greatly from trial to trial. So I don't know if I can exactly give a percentage.
Hmm.
But I will say that there are definitely participants that do drop out of studies. And there are definitely periods where research is prolonged because they don't have enough participants. I don't know that I've seen a lot of situations where they just full on stop, unless it's just gotten to that long of a point where they're not able to find more participants and they're not able to secure any more funding. Um, yes, I think that would be my answer to that question. Tiffany, do you have anything to add?
In my experience in my former life, I actually was a clinical research professional in regulatory. I would say in my experience, you don't really see many participants drop out, especially for chronic conditions because they are getting treated for their condition. And so the dropout rate typically is actually very low. In terms of stopping a study, it I will say this. Clinical trials cost millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. And so there is a bottom line in that aspect of it. So if you're not having enough subjects participate on the trial, you're not going to be able to collect enough data that's going to be meaningful enough for us to even move this drug forward. So there are instances in when a trial will stop because enrollment is not moving forward. And that could be for various reasons, right? Maybe people just aren't interested, or they may be afraid of the drug. It's been a lot of things. So very good question. Then Brittany, thank you so much for your insight as well. Adrian also has a question here. If you drop out of a trial, does that change your treatment schedule or will you have to start over again? And Brittany, again, I will let you go and then I can chime in after. Great question, Adrian.
I'll actually let you take this one, Tiffany.
Thank you, Brittany. Thank
Yes.
you so much, guys. So no. So again, and I had put this in the chat as well, and Brittany actually also mentioned it. If you go on a clinical trial, especially for something like cancer, you're never going to not get treated for your cancer. At a minimum, they're going to give you your standard of care for what your disease and state is. And so if you have to drop out of a trial for whatever reason, right? Maybe you don't want to do it anymore. Maybe you can't afford the travel, or maybe you're having some toxicity to the drug. We're not really sure if it's a combination or whatever. You don't have to start over at all. You will start where you are. You will go back to your treating oncologist. You will determine what the next steps are going to be for you. And that's going to be the course of your treatment. So it's not like you have to, if you go off a study, you're going to be like, oh my God, I got to start from square one again. That's absolutely not true. Where you are is where you're going to be met if you have to go off of the clinical trial. Ruben has a question, Brittany, but I'm not going to let you answer it yet because Brittany's going to actually talk about this. He didn't have a question, actually. He said trials are a smokescreen for testing something negative, i.e. a Tuskegee experiment, overall distrust of the system. And that is why we're here today, Ruben. That is why Brittany did this wonderful presentation to talk about the distrust, right? So even though we're talking about participation and why it's so important, we also have to acknowledge, as Brittany's going to brilliantly show you today, that we have to also understand the history.
Yeah, that was perfect, Ruben. I think that really speaks to a couple different points that we're going to bring up in this slide here. So thank you so much for adding that to the chat. Um, One of the concerns that I hear a lot is sugar pill or placebo treatment, which we did address a few slides ago. Just know that whenever you are facing a serious illness or disease, you will not just be receiving a sugar pill or a placebo treatment. You will be receiving, at the very minimum, standard of care for what's available to the public now, and then that it's dangerous. And I think this links back to the example that Ruben gave in the chat, that something very harmful is going to be given to the public and they're just testing for that. But again, just wanting to note that there are standards and regulations put in place to make sure that before these tests reach the human population, that it's as safe as possible, and that as they continue to test the safety and effectiveness of the drug, that is part of why they start with a smaller group and then branch out to bigger groups, so that at the very least they can catch it at a sooner stage and with less people involved as possible. And then again, I think this speaks to the example that Ruben gave in the chat, intentional infection. There's a fear that um, what people are being given is not to help them, but to harm them. And I think it's really important to note that these studies are tracked very closely. Um, the people involved have, I would say, their own careers at risk as well, in the potential of trying to intentionally infect someone um, could put all of that at risk for themselves as well. The thought that clinical trials are only for really sick or terminally ill people, which again we addressed earlier. Sometimes clinical trials are meant to focus on behavioral aspects. Sometimes they're meant to focus on caregivers or people in supportive positions. So it's not always necessarily just looking towards really sick people or terminally ill people. And then a thought of a guinea pig treatment. People imagine that again they're going to be the first to ever experience this drug ever, and again part of this is people not knowing that there are standards and regulations put into place to make it so that this is not the case for people. Now we're going to talk about barriers to participating in clinical trials, not so much the myths and misconceptions. So first, I want to talk about, I would say, the more commonly thought of barriers to participating in a clinical trial. So this can look like lack of transportation or distance, especially in cases where sometimes people find a clinical trial that's perfect for them, but is across the country. And so now you're looking at uplifting potentially your entire life and moving across the country so you can be involved in this clinical trial potentially, which leads me to financial concerns. What if you ain't got the money for that? What if you don't have the money to cover the cost of being involved in the clinical trial if your insurance doesn't cover it? So that's always a possibility as well. Being unaware of your eligibility. Maybe you don't have someone to help you look through all of the different standards of what it takes to be involved in a specific clinical trial. And so you're kind of spending a lot of time just shuffling through different things that you're not really, it's not a fit for you and you don't know that yet. A lack of childcare or communal support. Again, maybe you are a single parent and you don't have anybody around you that can help take care of your kids when you go to get your treatment. Maybe you don't have somebody that can help take you to treatment. Maybe you don't have somebody that can help cover the things that come with being involved in cancer treatments, the extreme fatigue, the potential depression, and other mental health issues. Maybe you just don't have the communal support to go through all of that. Maybe there's a lack of accessible materials and services. Maybe you need Braille and they don't have it. Maybe you need another language and they don't have it. Maybe you are one of 54% of this country who can't read above a sixth grade reading level, and you literally just can't understand the materials they're providing to you. These are all possibilities. And then I want to get into the systemic issues and the medical distrust that exist, that are based in very real things. And there's so much there. There's so much to cover, but we're going to go through just a few different examples. Um, and I do just want to give caution that this information is going to be really difficult to sit with for a lot of us. Um, it's no secret that there are very deep rooted issues in our medical and research institutions. And even when we don't know specific instances, we know the stories that are passed down through our communities, through our very DNA. Um, and it builds onto that sense of unease around the idea of getting involved in research or a clinical trial. And again, it's just really important to understand that these feelings are not baseless, they exist for a reason. Yes. So now we'll get into some of the more disturbing history. And once again, it may be difficult or distressing. Take time to step away if you need to. Um, yes, I truly understand the need to do that. We will still be here waiting for you when you get back. So we will start with the mothers of gynecology, Anarka, Betsy, and Lucy. They are foundational to the practice of gynecology. They are three of the named enslaved women that were experimented on without anesthesia or consent by Dr. James Marion Sims in the mid 1800s. Many slave owners were also physicians who bought and raised slaves to use them for experimentation. And I want to stress that even though this was commonplace And we know this because half of the original articles in the 1836 Southern Medical and Surgical Journal dealt with experiments performed upon enslaved Black people. But again, though this was commonplace, there were many people, including physicians, that were deeply opposed to it. And I stress this because I feel like there is a tendency to say, even up through the present, oh, it was of the times. That was just how things were then. And throughout history, whenever these things were happening, there was always pushback. And I think it's also important to note that there were people within the industry that were also physicians that were also pushing back against this. There were so many people that were opposed to it that actually, as his operations moved up north, Sims eventually hid his subject's race and even changed the illustrated reports of experiments from enslaved Black women to wealthy white women. And so it was mentioned before, actually, sorry, let me go back. The image on the right here is kind of an example of what that might have looked like when he changed the images. So, as stated before, he refused to give anesthesia to these women, but white women were given anesthesia for these very same procedures. He would say, oh, these procedures aren't bad enough for them to need this. But his own reflections actually contradict him as well. As we see here, Lucy's agony was extreme. She was much prostrated, and I thought she was going to die. His own writing also tells us that Anarcha was 17 and pregnant when he completed the first of 30 total surgeries on her, and Lucy spent 3 months in recovery from a surgery. Sims announced he'd perfected the viscovaginal fistula operation in May of 1849 after scores of operations over 5 years, with more than 30 of these operations on Anarcha alone. In 52, his paper on viscovaginal fistula repair was published in the American Journal of the Medical Sciences. It was following this that he was regarded as the father of American gynecology. So, as I did this research, I really wanted to make a point to try to find where any type of restorative justice happened, if anybody got any type of retribution, anything like that. So, it was never disclosed whether Sims closed the fistula of the other slave patients, though many of the time assumed this would be the case. He was given a very benevolent lighting in history, as happens. But again, this was not the case. His colleague turned critic, Nathan Bozeman, insisted that not one half of the enslaved women were afforded relief by the years of painful surgeries. He actually went on to correct a lot of them himself, as well as a case that Sims created himself when removing bladder stones from a 9-year-old slave girl. A statue of Sims was removed from Central Park in New York City in 2018 following a unanimous decision from a commission launched by then Mayor Bill de Blasio. There was much public protesting as well. There were a number of articles that were written in the city and submitted to the commission as well. A bust of Sims was also removed from his alma mater, Thomas Jefferson University, in late 2017. There are still 2 public monuments to Sims. One is in the South Carolina State House in Columbia, and the other is in the Alabama State Capitol in Montgomery. It is actually not very far, just a few blocks from the Mothers of Gynecology Monument that stands in Montgomery, Alabama as well. It was erected by Michelle Browder, created by Michelle Browder and erected in September of 2021. So I want to ask, before this presentation, did you know about the Mothers of Gynecology? Did you know anything about the history of this? It looks like most people did not. I'm not surprised. I say that because I feel like this conversation really only came to the forefront within the past less than 10 years. So there's more conversation around, oh, okay, it's looking like closer to an even split, 60% no, 40% yes. But still, I would say the conversation hadn't really come mainstream until probably within the past 7 years. So thank you. Thank you so much for participating in that poll. Next, we'll move forward to Henrietta Lacks. I think this is a figure and an example that most people are probably more aware of, but I did still want to get into this a bit deeper so that people could, if you did already know, get a good refresher, and if you didn't really understand the depths behind what happened here. So Henrietta Lacks was actually born Loretta Pleasant on October 1st in 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia. She was a Black poor tobacco farmer or sharecropper, and she passed at the age of 31 on October 4th in 1951 to cervical cancer in Baltimore, Maryland. Most scientists know her as Hella because cells were taken from her cervix lining without her consent twice. Once during a biopsy by Dr. George Otto Gay at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and the second time post-mortem by Gay's assistant, Mary Kubikek, without her consent once again. Her cells were eventually bought, sold, and shipped by the trillions to labs around the world and still are to this day. It's important to know that her cells helped with many, many advances in medicine, the polio vaccine, chemotherapy, in vitro fertilization, just to name a few. And the reason this was done was because for decades before this, scientists tried to keep human cells alive in culture. And Henriettas were the first cells that were actually able to do so. They reproduced an entire generation every 24 hours and never stopped, making them the first immortal cells. Now, what's also important to note is that she was rarely mentioned as these many great advancements in medicine were being made. Her name rarely came up. Her husband told Ebony Magazine in an interview in the 70s, "All I remember is that she had this disease, and right after she died, they called me in the office wanting to get my permission to take a sample of some kind. I decided not to let them." So I think it's extremely important to note here that not only did they not get her consent, they also directly disobeyed the husband's lack of consent. The family was also angry that her cells were being sold for $25 a vial, but also that articles were being published of pictures of them and the research that was being done with her cells without any of their knowledge. So, what became of this? The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks was released by Rebecca Skloot in early 2010. It was adapted to film 7 years later. The Henrietta Lacks Foundation was established in 2010 by the same author. And the foundation actually still continues to support the family to this day. The Lacks family reached an agreement with the National Institutes of Health in 2013 that gave them some control over how the DNA code from the Hella cells are used. They also filed a lawsuit against Thermo Fisher Scientific Incorporated in 2021 and settled after closed-door negotiations in 2023, one day before what would have been Henrietta's 103rd birthday. Lack's only living child, Lawrence Lack Sr., 86 at the time of the settlement, was only 16 years old when his mother died. So I think it's important to note that this family did get justice. It took 70 years to get there. Again, I'm happy it happened. I think it says a lot that it took this long or that long. The week before the settlement was reached, senators actually introduced a bill to posthumously award Henrietta the Congressional Gold Medal. However, this has yet to happen, though it was introduced again in May of 2025, and I assume that it will be reintroduced again this year. So we'll take a pause to ask the question, what do you think it takes to rebuild trust in the clinical and scientific research settings after a case like this?
While everyone is thinking about this, great question that Brittany asked here. Brittany, I want to put in this conversation, something that Taronda dropped in the chat. Out of curiosity, Taronda wants to know and bring up the conversation, what the approach is to take to animal rights activists that want to eliminate animal testing. And if this succeeds, will we go back to human testing on social economical challenged people? I can tell you 1000% the answer is no to that. So I do think that people who are against animal testing have to understand the context in which animals are being tested on when it comes to research such as cancer and chronic conditions, because it is 1000% unethical to do that on people. It just is. And so I do get the conversation. But we've had that, and I do think that they try to be as ethical as possible, especially even when it comes to the animals as well. I think that's a great conversation. I don't want to sidetrack from what Brittany just said, but thank you, Tarana, for bringing that up. But I can't see in any world where I'm alive that that's ever going to happen, that we'll revert back to that. So again, Monica, thank you so much. She thinks that one way we can rebuild trust is through time, outreach, and education. Ruben says transparency of the past and what changes have been done since. Thank you so much, Ruben, for saying that, which is exactly why we had this um, conversation in this webinar today. Stephanie says, invite the patient or caregiver to the meetings, give them the results of tests and explain the applications. Also, proper monetary compensation. Yes, ma'am, I am all about that. Transparency, again, that is something, a growing theme that I think the research community is trying to address. Where are my samples going? What will they be used for? And how will I maintain control of that future use? That's absolutely right, Adrian, that we need to know what's happening. And I think we need to be active, not only participants, we need to be active contributors to the research. I feel like a lot of times patients don't think they have a say in the research. And you should. You should have a say. You should know what's going on, not even just in your community, but around wherever the research is being done. Jana or Jana, I don't want to mispronounce. I'm not sure if it's Jana or Jana, but she says Jana. Thank you so much, Jana. Putting together a nice survey and implementing what people's voices in the said survey is in regards to clinical trials. You're absolutely right about that as well. We get more buy-in. We need more buy-in from our community. Third party monitoring, absolutely. Need to hear about successful outcomes, Yolanda. You couldn't have said it better. That is part of that transparency as well, because oftentimes you don't even know that a drug got approved, and you probably were on a clinical trial, and the only way you know is you see a commercial, right? I've had that happen in real life in my career, and I just think that's not fair and that's not right. I think as a participant who's giving my data, and data isn't just like numbers. Data is your samples. Data is your tissue. That's data as well. And so when I'm giving that up, I should be able to know what's going on with that in real time. I think so too. Deb said gaining trust will take decades and efforts to actively re-engage with disparaged communities. And I'm actually going to let Brittany take that on, because that's a larger discussion that is so needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to jump ahead too far,
I know,
but
right?
I will just say right now I completely agree. I think it was decades of harm that got us here, centuries even. And I think it will take a very long time to get to the point of full engagement from marginalized communities that have borne the brunt of this treatment. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you all again. These were really, really great answers. I really appreciate all of your engagement. Yeah, let's move right along. So now we'll talk about Fannie Lou Hamer a bit. Another figure that I think most people are probably more familiar with, but again, a nice refresher never hurts. In 1961, Fannie Lou Hamer's uterus was removed after going to the hospital to have what was likely a benign uterine fibroid tumor removed. Unfortunately, because of how the news traveled, she was one of the last people on her plantation to know that she would never be able to bear a family of her own. Following this, it was actually a really big catalyst for her to be more politically active and involved. She tried to register to vote and was rejected at the polling booth, and then kicked off the plantation that she lived on because they felt that she was causing too much of a ruckus. She went on to speak consistently about her Mississippi appendectomy, as well as the children that she would never have. She ran for Congress. She founded and led many community and political organizations. Really a force to be reckoned with. And again, it's very sad to say it, but losing the ability to have children was a catalyst for her to become one of the most powerful leaders and symbols of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. So again, going to get into some tougher details. So I just wanted to give fair warning to that. By 1934, there were already 17 U.S. states routinely performing sterilizations. By this point, between 2,000 and 4,000 Americans were sterilized. I also do want to note that I believe one of the first cases of sterilization in the country was actually regarding a mentally disabled girl. And so that is where a lot of the basis started. And then they just really branched out from there to anybody that I would say that they saw as invalid. Less than 10 years later, sterilization had been forced on between 70,000 to 100,000 Americans. It was 20 years later that Fannie Lou Hamer's uterus was removed. And about 12 years after this, we see 12-year-old Mary Alice Rolfe and her 14-year-old sister, Minnie Rolfe, surgically sterilized without their consent. After they sought legal advice and help from Atlanta's Southern Poverty Law Center, lawyers found that between 100,000 and 150,000 women had been sterilized using federal funds, and half of these women were Black. 10 years later, we find that Black people constituted only 12% of the population, but 43% of the women sterilized in federally funded programs. In the early 2000s, it was reported that 1/3 of all adult Mississippi women had undergone a hysterectomy. This jumped up to 57% when we're looking at all Mississippi women that are 65 and older. Again, I think it's important to note that throughout history, we see people continuously pushing back against this from within the industry, from within the study. And so in 1972, Boston City Hospital medical students protested the policy of performing unnecessary hysterectomies on Black women in order to allow residents to practice. They noted that experimental procedures, the coercion of patient signatures, and falsifying medical records were common practice among Black patients. Students at Columbia University also protested similar practices. A year later, the same year that Minnie and um, oh my goodness, I can't believe I just forgot their name. I'm so sorry. I'm gonna go back so I can get it. Mary Alice, and Minnie were surgically sterilized. The very same year, there was a study by Bernard Rosenfeld of LA County Hospital that discovered that doctors were subjecting mostly poor and Black women to surgical sterilization without explaining the potential hazards nor alternative methods of birth control. So again, they had the option to at least give a different form of birth control, but that was never presented to these people. In most major teaching hospitals of New York, it was the unwritten policy to do elective hysterectomies on poor Black and Puerto Rican women with minimal indications to train residents. Women were also forced into sterility by governmental welfare programs. Basically, through the 60s and 70s, social workers would conduct late night raids, and if a man was found, the family's aid could be terminated unless the woman agreed to be sterilized. This changed with federal regulations established in 79, 5 years after the Ralph v. Weinberger case. Largely, patients were lied to, consent forms were forged, or medical records were falsified to show an appendectomy or gallbladder removal. And because of this, we will never know the exact number of African American women who were sterilized without their knowledge or consent. So before we go on, how are we feeling? And what do we think after covering this history and information? Especially if maybe this is the first time you've been exposed to this. How are you feeling and now that you know this information?
I am upset. Um, I was gonna put in the chat, but I just can't imagine in any circumstance where forced sterilization should even be allowed. I just don't see in any circumstance where that's available. And while you were talking, Brittany, I was actually doing some Adrian's mad. Me too. I was gonna say a curse word, girl. But I'm gonna drop in the chat too. Just I think it's the National Women's Law Center, just so you can, if you're interested to understand what the sterilization laws in each state or in your state. But that's thank you so much for that history. And that's something also why this type of webinar and this education is so important, especially in our community, because we didn't know that happened, right? We didn't know that happened, what the ramifications of that were. Like Fannie Lou, like she was forced into a situation she didn't ask to be in, to not be able to have a family. And so that's just very, and I think that's part of our, I will say part of my healing process that I even had to get to once I became part in this clinical research world and understood the things that happened before, even though I'm doing this work now. So we need people like you to give this information out there, just for education purposes. And that's how you heal. When you know, you can understand how things have moved forward and how we can move forward as well. So thank you for that.
I just wanted to say that I'm not surprised. I live in New York, and I remember when Mayor de Blasio had that statue taken down.
Mhm.
Also, as a nurse, and it made me think back to it was around 1983, maybe 84, where I always remember this woman who was my patient, and I had come on in the morning shift to prepare her for surgery. And she had signed the consent to have, I quote unquote, probably an exploratory, abdominal exploratory uh, experience. The following day, or maybe I'm sorry, that night, I was on the night shift. That night when I came on duty, when I made my rounds, she was crying. And I asked her what happened, what's upsetting you? And she said they took my uterus out. And she said they didn't tell me they were going to do that. And it's a story that I want to write about as in an essay narrative concerning her, to get the word out. And I thank you for what you're doing to bring this to the light. And
I'm you to that, Miss Jacqueline. You're writing that essay, ma'am. I'm holding you to it.
I'm working on it. I'm working on memoirs of my career as a nurse and the racism and the trauma that I personally experienced, and also my own personal trauma and experience going through biopsy under this Southern Georgia white female doctor. And she did not, I thought back to how she did not prepare me for the biopsy. So when she performed the biopsy, I was just in so much pain and agony. She was supposed to tell me to take an antihistamine type, like a Motrin or something, 20 minutes before the procedure, so I wouldn't feel the pain that I felt.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm so sorry
Okay.
that you were subjected to that. But again, thank you so much for sharing. We need people to share stories like this so we can create a better understanding of our conditions and so that we can advocate for each other better and fight what's happening. So thank you again. And thank you to everyone that has shared in the chat as well. Truly appreciate it. Were there any other thoughts before we move forward?
I will say that Cynthia dropped in the chat this great comment. This is why we must advocate for ourselves and each other. We have to do our own research and ask questions. There's never a stupid question when it comes to your health. Never, never. So that's very good. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for dropping that gem in the chat for us.
So, how do we move forward? And this is another question I kind of want to pose to the audience before I give my opinion. This is a conversation, so I really want to hear what everyone else has to say. I know we kind of talked about it a little bit a few slides back, but what do we think it takes after knowing all of the information that's been posed? What do we think it takes now, present day, to move forward knowing this history? I think some of the answers earlier were things like time, outreach, education, transparency on the past and what's happened, what changes have been made since, radical transparency and accountability, commitment to serve the community, inviting more patients and caregivers to be a part of the process, um, community engaged research. I think that's perfect answer, Leah. Events like this, leadership that looks like us, making sure that the patient understands what's entailed in the surgery. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it takes that intentionality.
Mhm.
Absolutely. So,
Oh, look at this. Y'all are on there. Yeah.
right, I love it.
That would be too.
Having more diverse people working in clinical trials, clinical study reparations. They I won't go too deep into it, but there was a very wide period of time where there were a lot of really harmful experiments done. And it was actually after government intervention and investigation that those people were able to actually receive their reparations. They were able to receive validation on what happened to them. And they won their lawsuits. And it took a while. The studies took place from basically the 1940s to the 1990s, and it wasn't really until the 90s that really started to come out and be um, more common knowledge or more mainstream, I guess I would say. It didn't come to light until that time, but fortunately, those people at those times, they did get their reparations. So at least some people that we know of were able to get clinical study reparations. Doctors that are aware of the history, yes. Involving communities, educating our people about protections that have been put in place to prevent repeating history.
I think with the ways we move forward too is, and I always say this as well, because when we say patient education, that assumes that you're uneducated, and that's never the case. I know we're educated, we know our bodies and things like that. So I do think the way we move forward too is that in the research community, one, we do need to be more diverse, and two, they have to do their part as well. That's what you go to medical school for. That's what you get training for. That is your job. Your job is to let people know that clinical trials exist. I can't tell you how many people I've come across that do not know clinical trials exist, or that there was a clinical trial for their condition. Now, they may not have been eligible for it, which is true, but I do think that researchers need to take more of an assertive effort to not only tell people about patients about clinical trials, but make a concerted effort to recruit people, especially diverse people of color. And I always say this, and I got to say it before we get off, is that all of these drugs that we have that are approved are based on data that do not represent the people it affects the most, especially when it comes to something like endometrial cancer. So all the drugs that we're using, which are working great for many of you, I know some of you say you're in remission, and that's wonderful. But we need to know how this disease even affects us. Why is it affecting us more than everybody else? And when I say us, Black women, we have to, and we're never going to understand that if we don't get these clinical trials and data from Black women. We must do that in order to move forward as well. I'm off my soapbox. Back to you, Brittany. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. It blends perfectly with what we're talking about. So thank you. Thank you for adding that. I will say, I think one of the first steps for moving forward is honesty and accountability. As many people have noted, we have to have radical honesty. We have to understand what has happened in the past that has led us to this point of such great contention and distrust for the medical community across marginalized communities. I think one of the key things that I learned while doing research from the author Harriet A. Washington of Medical Apartheid: The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. I highly recommend this read. It is a thickie. It is a thick read, and it is a heavy read, but I definitely recommend it if you want more information on what we've covered today. But one of the things that I did learn, I believe it was in the introduction to the book, was that the author originally wanted to use the painting of James Marion Sims experimenting on some of the mothers of gynecology. I believe the painting was done by Robert Toms, and the copyright is actually owned by Pfizer. And so, mind you, this was about 20 years ago, roughly 20 years ago, that the author went to Pfizer, asked for permission to use the book. Pfizer said, "Can we see the book?" She said, "No, you can see the section that I'm referencing him in." And after that, they told her no. And so, again, I think in the part of honesty and accountability, especially from the end of these corporations involved in these medical industries, you have to be honest about what happened. And when people are trying to shed light on this, I think it's also their responsibility to help do that as well. We cannot move forward if we just keep it all hidden away, locked away in the past. And so, pretty much as Tiffany was saying, I think that these research institutions and these people very high up with that, have been a part of these institutions and industries for a very long time also have to do their part to say, yes, this happened. We need to address this so we can move forward together. And then I would say, again, like many have said, they have to be with us. They have to be in our community and they have to be community. It's one thing to be there. It's another thing to say, I will stand with you. I hear you. I'm listening, and not just coming in assuming that because I have these resources, I know what to do. And because I have a hand in it, I know what to do to fix it. But understanding us on a peer to peer level and understanding the importance of us being involved. And again, just what that takes for us to build back together. And then I would say restorative justice with a tailored approach, because I think this is going to look different for each marginalized community. And that's not even going into the fact of, the specifics around this was done to Black people, this was done to Black women, this was done to Black children. And so what does that look like addressing that across the board and within intersectional identities for each of these communities as well. Because you can't just give a general answer or a general solution to everyone. And I think that goes back to being in and being community. You have to see each other clearly. You have to see the full history that is there to know how to step forward. There's such a great need for disaggregated data, and disaggregated basically just means you're taking data that has been generalized and breaking it down into groups or further subcategories so that you can gain a better understanding of the data that exists there. So a good example is for a long time, it was said that Asian Americans don't have, they encounter ovarian cancer at lower rates. And yes, that can be true for the general community. But when you break down that data further, you see the specifics for different specific Asian groups. And so when you overgeneralize this data, you're missing historical elements as to why there may be higher rates of occurrence for different diseases or illnesses. You're missing cultural relevance as to why that might be the case. Environmental elements as to why that might be the case, because it can't be missed that a lot of the reason that some people encounter certain diseases and illnesses is because of the environmental conditions that they are subjected to. And so it all ties in, it all correlates, and we have to look at that very clearly, very intentionally, very distinctly to be able to move forward in a meaningful way, in my opinion. So moving forward, I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about the personal, communal, and societal benefits to being involved in a clinical trial. I know we've gone through a lot of history and a lot of reasons as to why people might not want to be involved, but this is building trust and understanding in clinical trials. We do want to ultimately help you see the importance of our people being involved in clinical trials. One comment that was actually put in the chat earlier that I thought was really important. It was a comment and a question, trying to find it now, but it was roughly along the lines of, are these studies and this data relevant specifically to the Black community? Are Black people involved, or is this data specifically on white people that's being generalized to everyone else? And so to help combat that, we have to be involved because yes, for a long time, there was a lot of research and there was a lot of data that was just white people being researched and it being generalized to the rest of us. That ends when we are involved in a just way, in an ethical way, in a way that makes sense for us and our community. So, going into the benefits of being involved in a clinical trial. Personal, it really could save your life. It could be the exact treatment that you need for your illness or disease. It can help contribute to historic shifts in research. I mean, even just thinking about Henrietta Lacks, her cells were the first cells to ever be able to do that. Her cells are the reason that we have so much progress with treatments to so many different illnesses, and just answers to so many different medical advancements that we've needed. We wouldn't have that without her. Receiving specialized support. When you are going through a clinical trial, that is probably some of the most specialized support that you can get. It's tailored for you. They're looking at your side effects very, very closely, especially to gain a better understanding of what that drug and treatment is doing. On a communal level, it can help identify community specific issues or solutions, as we were talking about briefly with the disaggregated data, improving the research experience for your community. Kind of like what was mentioned as far as something that can be done to help us move forward, putting out a survey and implementing the feedback from that survey and how we continue to move forward with the different programs and trials and research that's being done. And it highlights the need for disaggregated data. On a societal level, the results in data not only help our personal communities, but it gives a greater context for that illness or disease or drug or treatment on a broader scale. Researchers all over the world depend on each other's research, and that's just the truth of things. When you find something, it helps the entire community gain a better understanding. And even if the results aren't for the best, even if it doesn't lead to a new change in the standard of treatment, we still gain a better understanding of what does and doesn't work. It validates the need for more inclusive research. Again, as we've talked about, there have been decades of research being generalized for one community to the rest of us. And again, this helps to fight that directly. And yes, being involved in a clinical trial can potentially save your life. It could potentially go on to help save so many other lives as well. In part 2 of our webinar series on Saturday, March 21st, at the same time as this one, they'll be answering more questions and discussing a bit more about their experiences with their clinical trial involvement or their experimental drug experiences.